Our next founder is James A. Bayard. James A. Bayard was a Princeton graduate who had actually studied law under Joseph Reed, a very important American founder in his own right. Uh, Bayard went back home to Delaware he kind of misses the Revolutionary War because he's a little bit younger, but at just 29 years old, he's elected to the United States House of Representatives. He becomes a very important Federalist, and he would actually serve several presidents in the first 2 decades of America under the Constitution. He is there for many important precedents. Now, the big story in James A. Bayard's life comes during the election of 1800. Now, if you've seen the play Hamilton, the musical Hamilton, you'll know that Alexander Hamilton was given a very important choice. Who should he support? His old buddy Aaron Burr or his nemesis Thomas Jefferson? And Hamilton famously supports Jefferson, saying essentially, even though I disagree with Jefferson's ideals, at least Jefferson has principles and will stand on them, as opposed to Burr, who in Hamilton's eyes could be flippant and change his opinions based on who was the room just to get ahead in life. Now, if you've seen the play Hamilton, it's indicated that Hamilton shouts the name Jefferson from the rooftops. In fact, I think he is actually standing on a roof in the play, shouting it to the world. This is not how things worked at the time, because Hamilton had already resigned several years before from the Treasury Department, and he was in New York City over here, and the the United States Congress was in Washington, D.C. Oh, Philadelphia? No, I don't know if they went for Philadelphia at this point. Oh, by late 1800, yes, because John Adams moved to Washington, D.C. Rewind. Hamilton's in New York City, and Congress is in Washington, D.C., so even if Hamilton did shout it from the rooftops, they weren't going to hear it. So what did Hamilton do? He wrote it in a letter, as they did at the time. They gave it to the post office, who traveled the letter by horseback down to Washington, D.C. But who did he send the letter to? Not to Congress. No. He sent it to his friend, his mouthpiece, James A. Bayard. And it's James A. Bayard who goes in and speaks on Hamilton's behalf, not necessarily at Congress, but to other Federalists in Washington, D.C., saying, like, look at this letter I got from Hamilton. This is what he's saying. They asked Bayard to write to Hamilton. Hamilton writes back to him and says Jefferson. Now, there's one really, really interesting line in this correspondence. As I said, Hamilton didn't just go shouting from the rooftops, but he was nervous about Burr's ambitions. And the line in the letter to Bayard is referencing, if Burr were to be elected, quote, let us not be responsible for the evils which in all probability will follow. End quote. Literally saying, if Burr's elected, then there are going to be evils. And I don't want to be blamed for him. It's very intense, really demonstrating his opinion of Aaron Burr. And again, there would still be 4 years worth of arguments before there's actually a duel. And I'm not aware of Burr actually ever reading that letter. I doubt he did. So James A. Bayard, for his part, he does later go on to participate in the United States Senate. He fills up vacancy, so he's only there for about 2 or 3 years, not a full term. And he spends he's only there for a few years and then gets reelected to a full term. Let me say that again. And he ends up spending about a decade in the United States Senate. He is against declaring war in the War of 1812, but when hostilities break out, he takes kind of a turn of phrase and really supports President Madison and becomes a real supporter of James Madison, showing his loyalty to his country. He disagreed with the war. He was a Federalist who disagreed with Madison as a Democratic Republican, but once the war was declared, he threw his lot in with the President of the United States. Because of his support, you would think he'd be looked down on by other Federalists, but he was not. He's actually goes on to be one of the 5 peace commissioners sent to the Netherlands to sign the Treaty of Ghent, which ends the War of 1812. He is there there are 5 other people. I don't remember all of them, but I know Henry Clay is a young man making his name there. And John Quincy Adams is a middle-aged man by this point who's already made a name for himself and would later go on to be Secretary of State and then the United President of the States. President of the United States is probably how I should say that. And then he's actually is then appointed to replace John Quincy Adams as the minister to Russia, though he turns it down. And this is where his story gets a little bit sad. He turns it down. He doesn't want to go to Russia. He wants to return to America. And he gets on a boat and journeys home. And he gets off the boat. And just 5 days after he makes it back to the United States, he falls ill and he passes away. And that is the life of James A. Bayard, a man who worked as Hamilton's mouthpiece during one of the most interesting elections in American history, and then went over to help end the War of 1812, a war he didn't think should be fought in the first place. I hope you learned something about James A. Bayard. Like and subscribe.